Hey, hello everyone. This is Martin Talks for another episode of Martin Talks, where I decided to do something a little different. I decided to do a tier list ranking of David Bowie's albums. I thought it would be something, pretty easy and done, but it turned out that the recording actually lasted a lot longer than I expected. Turns out I have much more information about David Bowie than I expected. So as a result, the actual recording ended up lasting 2 hours. So what I decided I would do was do a shorter primer into the general ranking. And if you are interested to hear my reasoning or whatever about a specific album here, there are timestamps in the video description that you can click on, and then you can hear me rant for ages and ages. To quickly explain my rating system, I decided to do something a little different because I like a lot of these albums. A lot of these albums would be like 8 out of 10s, 9 out of 10s, 10 out of 10s. There's basically nothing below a 5, so I thought it wouldn't be particularly fun if everything was on the top categories. Consequently, I decided to do something a little different. Essential and great means something that is, not only paramount to the catalog of the artist, but is also something I like a lot. Great but not essential, everything I like very, very much, but I wouldn't recommend to a newcomer. Essential, but I don't like it as much. Something I would recommend to a newcomer, but I don't find quite as good as the best albums. Basically, it's only formality so that the category up there isn't completely packed. It's alright is basically anything that I think is pretty good, but not something I would perhaps put on regularly. And fans only is the stuff that I may like, but I still really wouldn't consider to newcomers, only to really dedicated fans who have heard everything else. Now, that being said, here's a quick explanation for everything here. David Bowie 1967, it's a bunch of quaint little pop ditties with occasional experimentation, but there really isn't much to it. It doesn't really show the full potential of David Bowie. Pinups, it's a bunch of covers. Once again, some of them are pleasant, but ultimately not very representative of Bowie as a whole, and I don't listen to it very much. Tonight, it's an album I do listen to very much, but it's honestly the one with the least with the least well-defined personality. It's an album that was rushed in its writing, and it really shows. The only songs that were written by David Bowie exclusively, Loving the Alien and Blue Jean, are the best ones by far, and the rest is rather kind of plotting or somewhat boring or somewhat messy little reggae numbers or rock numbers, and many of these are covers. So not very interesting and easily his worst album. Space Oddity, The Man Who Sold the World, and Young Americans all have a couple of great tracks each, but the problem is that the remaining material is fairly inconsistent, with only a few share of deep cuts that I would consider highlights. Not bad, but not exactly amazing. Not that there are a bunch of songs that I would easily pass on, like Running Gun Blues, Sign a Committee. Well, Sign a Committee is pretty good, but yeah, I don't know. Can You Hear Me, and the cover Across the Universe. Black Tie White Noise is a little different. I do find a lot of songs on there very good, but the thing is, it runs a little too long for my taste. It clocks in at 1 hour. The 90s dance production values, I don't mind that much. I'm fairly tolerant towards that sort of stuff, so it gels with me just fine. Hours has a similar issue as the others, except it has no song that is that recognizable in comparison to the rest. I do like Thursday's Child, 7, and The Dreamers, but otherwise, Same goes for Reality. Couple of good songs. Pablo Picasso, Bring Me the Disco King. Reality, Otherwise, The Next Day, again, same thing as the rest. I do like The Next Day, The Stars Are Out Tonight, Heat, and Where Are We Now? Now, we get into Essential, but I don't like it as much. Honestly, most of these albums are really good. I think this is 9 out of 10, 9 out of 10, 8 out of 10, solid 7 out of 10, though it has some pretty inconsistent material. I understand it might look weird because this is practically all of Bowie's glam era, but I decided to put them here because just to really make a distinction between those and those here. I feel I spin these albums much less often than I do these up there. So this is a matter of personal taste. They are still very good albums, but nevertheless, it's stuff that I don't like as much, but I wholeheartedly recommend them. Ziggy Stardust is one of the best entry points into David Bowie. Great but not essential. Now these are mostly 9 out of 10 and 8 out of 10 albums. In fact, I would say that Ziggy Stardust and Hunky Dory are better than this, and this. But that being said, these are albums I spin a lot more often, but I would not recommend to a newcomer. Larger, lots of very fancy experimentation, proto-Death Grips track in African Night Flight, but somewhat of more of an oddity. Let's Dance. People generally know it for the singles, and while I do like the remaining songs quite a lot, the difference in quality is especially noticeable. David Bowie Never Let Me Down, you're gonna have to hear my full explanation for it. It takes quite a while, but simply put, in spite of the overbearing 80s production, I consider the songs extremely good at times, oftentimes. And in fact, I can digest the 80s production just fine. But nevertheless, it's something to be on the watch out for. It's considered to be Bowie's worst album, and I can understand why, but there's a lot more to it than you might realize. It is quite densely packed. The Buddha of Suburbia might be very overlooked because it was billed as a TV soundtrack. But in reality, it's some of Bowie's best material of the 90s. Easily his best album of the 90s, with outside very close behind. It is perhaps his best mix between his 90s electronic experimentation and his earlier late 70s rock experimentation with some ambient tunes. Earthling, a very distinctively drum and bass work. Some of the rhythms are kind of stock, but I consider it a very charming album with a lot of really cool experimentation, especially for Dead Man Walking, a very explosive industrial electronic tune. Heathen, a bit of a late career masterpiece where he lapses more into more straightforward rock, with a couple covers of straightforward rock material such as Cactus by the Pixies. It has grown off me a little bit with time. There are some songs that don't stand up quite as well, but there are still quite some very good songs like Slow Burn, Sunday, Heathen, The Rays, Everyone Says Hi. There we go. Essential and great. Not only are would I consider these paramount to your understanding of David Bowie, they are easily among his best albums, and among some of my favorite albums of all time as well. Station to Station is the gold standard of Bowie. His best mix of musical structure experimentation, as well as powerful emotion. The ballads on it have grown on me exponentially with time, but the more straightforward funk and rock material such as the title track or TBC-15 or Stay are amazing as well. For the sheer consistency of it, it very much threatens to take the place of Heroes, which for the moment I consider my favorite album of his, as well as one of my 3 favorite albums of all time. Low End Heroes, very well known. The first two albums that David Bowie would do in collaboration with Brian Eno, masterful mix of electronically enhanced rock music, along with ambient suites on the second side. I prefer Heroes over Low because it is a bit more vibrant and explosive in its tone, whereas Low, which was very much reflective of Bowie's mood at the time, being on rehab, more or less, from his cocaine addiction, consequently, it was a fairly more reserved album in terms of sheer energy. And also, the ambient pieces on Heroes are I would say, a bit more evocative than those on Low. Scary Monsters and Super Creeps, his new wave album, it's extremely good in the first half. Up until Teenage Wildlife, it could threaten to be his best album. It's just that he could have taken 1 or 2 songs off to try and to really seal the deal. I think the cover of Kingdom Come, a song by Tom Verlaine of the post-punk group Television, kind of fucks it up a bit. But otherwise, excellent album. Outside, strictly speaking, I would put this in great but not essential. But the thing is, I consider Bowie's 90s experimental electronic era to be vastly overlooked. And consequently, I decided to put this, especially, in the essential and great category. It's an excellent foray into industrial rock with quite a fair amount of jazz and of jazz leanings. Especially in songs such as The Motel a little bit, and also A Small Plot of Land. There is and also it has a very cool concept in a sort of a dystopian future about where murder is perceived by some to be an art form in of its own. So it's also a very interesting album to read about. And also when it comes to its origins, there is an earlier version of this album that consists of 3 long songs lasting more than 20 minutes that is available as a bootleg. It's called the Leon Suites. And finally, Blackstar. There has been much discussion about it since David Bowie's death. And I considered it an excellent album already without even knowing that this was inspired, in fact, by his impending death from liver cancer. But knowing about it, it does help strengthen the record even more, because even if he had survived, it would have still very much informed the experience and the emotions that went into the making of this record. And it is easily some of the most daring material that he has ever put out. So these are the rankings for the David Bowie albums. If you want to see my full reasoning, you can listen to the full recording that's going to come about in just a few moments. Thank you, and I'll see you later. Hey, hello everyone, this is MARTINTALKS, and here we're doing something fairly different from the standard video output, which is nothing. I have seen that these tier lists through the Tier Maker website have been all the rage these days, and I thought to myself, well, hey, if there anything is certain about human nature, is that we love to put different things in different categories and use that as a way to determine their quality. After all, just ask the Ku Klux Klan. Anyways, I thought I would offer my own perspective and review, or rather put into a list, David Bowie's albums. Now, we're going to go straight into it. As you can see, we have 5 different categories. This is a little different from a standard, S tier, A, B, C, D. Simply put, there isn't a single album in this entire list that I don't like. Full stop. So we're going to put this a little differently. On top, you have Essential and Great. Not only is it necessary for your understanding of David Bowie, and perhaps your understanding of music in general, but it's also a really fucking good album. Just below that, there's Great but not Essential. I like it a lot, but I wouldn't exactly say it's paramount to have it if you are, say, a newcomer. After that, you have Essential, but I don't like it as much. Basically, it's all of the popular albums that I don't think are as good as the other popular albums. After that, you have It's Alright, which is basically anything that doesn't go in the above categories. And at the bottom, you have Fans Only, which is every album that fucking sucks, but I like anyways. Now, we're going to begin very quickly with David Bowie's first album, his self-titled record from 1967, Fans Only. At that point, a couple of years before that actually, David Bowie had been in a multitude of rock bands, mostly just standard Mersey beat, mod pop bands, and basically none of them were successful. He had to stay with a whole bunch of groups, including, say, the Manish Boys, the King Bees, I believe, but none of them scored a really big hit. Most of his older singles before this record can be heard on his compilation Early On, which was released in 1991. Now, at this point in time, in 1967, when he put out this album, he still didn't really find his footing as an artist. He didn't really find his style, even if that style involves, well, switching from one style to another with almost every album. This 1967 album is more of a quaint collection of pop songs, with some topics being a little more interesting than others. But otherwise, it's a very quaint and innocent thing. It's like your uncle coming over to your house and telling you a nice little story when you were a kid. Though there is some pretty interesting material. I think the most interesting of it, and one that would foreshadow a bit his next record, is We Are Hungry Men, which recalls a story of overpopulation leading to cannibalism, more or less an analogy of Soylent Green. Well, I believe that's the movie. I believe it was based on a novel before that, but I don't know if it had a different name. But it is a story in that similar vein. But otherwise, it's a very quaint pop with an occasionally psychedelic bent to it. I do like a couple of songs like Sell Me a Coat, Love You Till Tuesday. But otherwise, it's not a very essential album. And it hardly shows the full capability of David Bowie as an artist. And also as a guy who really knows how to choose his performing musicians. With that, we go to his second record, Space Oddity, it was also a self-titled album, but it was re-released in 1972. The original release was in 1969, but the re-release was called Space Oddity. And I would put it at... it's a close tie between Essential, but I don't like it as much, and It's Alright. But we're going to put it in It's Alright category, because everyone knows it at least... If there's one song that everyone knows from it, it's one of his most popular songs as well. It's Space Oddity, and it's a great song about the space age. Once again, it foreshadows We Are Hungry Men from the first album foreshadowed this slight bit of interest in science fiction and space and all that. But that being said, not that much of the album touches upon space or whatever. It's more of a psychedelic folk record, if you can believe that. Yes, indeed. In 1969, it wasn't exactly the peak of flower power by then, but nevertheless, it's a very good collection of psychedelic, sometimes folksy material, albeit rather inconsistent. Like, the album opens with Space Oddity, but right after that you have Unwashed and Somewhat Slightly Dazed, which starts off with a very nice, ominous atmosphere, but then turns into a bit of a Bob Dylan stand-up that doesn't work quite as well. And there is occasional experiment with progressive rock, such as in Sign a Committee, which does feel a bit overwrought. It does last 10 minutes. Personally, I prefer the shorter and somewhat more quaint material, such as An Occasional Dream or God Knows I'm Good, which is a little more reserved than the big numbers on the record, but are very pleasant. Another interesting track is Letter to Hermione, which was dedicated to someone he was hanging out at the time, Hermione Farthingale, but who ended up pretty much leaving him around the time she began performing, because she's an actress, performing in the movie Song of Norway. And as a fun fact, David Bowie would actually reference the film Song of Norway on a t-shirt in the music video for Where Are We Now in 2013. But we're getting a little ahead of ourselves, aren't we? Otherwise, good album, it's alright. But, it's aside from Space Oddity and say, oh, I do love Janine and Memory of a Free Festival. It's a great closer. But otherwise, it's alright. And in a similar category, I would actually dare put the following record, The Man Who Sold the World, as well. You could potentially argue that it could fit into Essential, but I don't like it as much, but I'm not quite certain about it. It's another case of an album where there is one song that is extremely well known, the title track, but the rest is not as well known. If I believe, this was around the point in time where he would begin collaborating with people who would form the skeleton of the Spiders from Mars. So it would include people like, I believe it is the point where we would start working with people such as, I wouldn't dare say Mike Garson because he's a pianist, but I do believe it's the point where he began collaborating with Tony Visconti, and he would do that until Let's Dance in 1980, Scary Monsters in 1980, sorry, one album off. Regardless, what I believe were the circumstances leading to the album was that at the time, Bowie had actually gotten a son, who would become Duncan Bowie, if I do believe, and consequently, a lot of the focus of the songwriting was delegated to the other collaborators. The end result is an album that would stand out quite a fair bit from everything else in Bowie's catalog, but also doesn't quite have the Bowie stamp in a sense. It's still quite a good album, but my main issue with it is that it's a little one note. Simply put, it's borderline a heavy metal album, or at least a very pronounced hard rock record. But aside from a couple of songs, not everything is that distinctive. I would say the major distinctive numbers are the 8-minute opener Width of a Circle, which has an even better version in the Ziggy Stardust motion picture live performance, basically David Bowie's final performance as Ziggy Stardust in 1972. And among the other songs would include All the Madman is quite good as well, though I do like a lot of the 1987 reinterpretation. We'll get to that later, hopefully, assuming I don't forget. And obviously there is the title track, which is quite good, though I do find it a little, let's say, plotting in a sense. It has sort of an ominous, imposing energy, flair to it, but it is a little reserved, especially compared to the heavier rock material as well. And I also do like the Superman, the closing title track. But otherwise, the rest of the songs is, a hard rock rave up, another one, and maybe an occasional quieter number to shake things up, like After All. End result, it's alright. But finally we start entering into the territory of classics. In those first three albums, Bowie was only beginning to warm up, and it's only on the following record, Hunky Dory, that he would finally attain his first truly realized identity. But I would put it in essential, but I don't like it as much. It's considered to be one of his best albums, and by all means, I consider it a great album. However, I would not consider it among his best, which is why it doesn't go in the, well-coveted top category there. My main problem with it is that it's probably the most disjointed Bowie album. Well, there may be an exception, and that's tonight. But once again, we'll get to that later. Considering his material in the 1970s, that's basically the peak of Bowie, for the most part. The album is quite a lot more disjointed. It feels a lot more like a collection of songs than a full-fledged record in its own right, with a clear progression. Even, say, Space Oddity had a quite well-established progression in mood from one song to another, whereas here it's not quite the same. Or at the very least, for all the classic songs that it has, Changes, Life on Mars, Oh You Pretty Things, I'm sure there are some others. Hell, there are a bunch I like a lot. Those three, Andy Warhol, Queen Bitch is pretty nice, Quicksand. There are a bunch of great tracks, but the lower points are a bit more pronounced. I don't really think that much of Kooks or Song for Bob Dylan. Not that much big on the version of Fill Your Heart. Personally, Tiny Tim has done that song much better. So because of this inconsistency and sort of lack of clear structuring in how the album evolves, it doesn't feel as strongly as other records. I put in the essential but I don't like it as much category, but by all means, it's a great album. I'm glad I got that shit on vinyl. Then we get to the crux of the Bowie canon. Ziggy Stardust and the Spiders from Mars. The rise and fall of Ziggy Stardust and the Spiders from Mars. And I would put it in the same category as Hunky Dory. Now, those two albums are his... Hunky Dory was pretty much the start of Bowie's glam period. Arguably, more or less, definitely his most popular era. And... simply, I've never been that much of a fan of Bowie's glam era, at least compared to his other eras of experimentation. I do appreciate it a lot. Ziggy Stardust is another great album. I think it's really great, but I don't know. It doesn't feel as bold or as daring, at least from my current perception. I can't say anything for what it was in 1972, because this is the album that in some way broke him into the mainstream. In fact, the reason Space Oddity got a re-release in 1972 was because starting with this album, he really fucking started selling. And it was pretty much to capitalize on the fact that in 1973... Wait, no. Re-released in 1972. Nah, never mind. 1973, that's a little later. But yeah, the re-release was because he was starting to really accrue popularity, not just in the UK, but in the United States as well. He was touring the States. Anyways, Hunky Dory was the start of his glam era. Well, Ziggy Stardust is the start of his glam rock era. And, it's got a lot of very famous songs. 5 Years, Moonage Daydream, Starman, Ziggy Stardust, Suffragette City, Rock and Roll Suicide. Probably Hang On to Yourself is fairly well known as well. It's got a lot of great tunes. Perhaps the thing that keeps it from reaching the higher rungs for me is there's a couple of songs that are as strong, such as Star and It Ain't Easy, though they are quite good as well. Or perhaps it's this somewhat tame production. I was actually quite surprised when I had first listened to this album, having listened to Queen beforehand, all of Queen's albums, to hear how reserved and somewhat subdued the production is. It's not something that explosive. In comparison, Queen is quite the opposite, at least in its more bombastic efforts. But still, a great album. Now we get to the sequel, more or less, to Ziggy Stardust, one that follows very much in that same vein, Aladdin Sane. And this is where the system starts falling a little apart. I wouldn't call it outright great, but it's I'd say it's essential, actually. It's more or less a sequel to Ziggy Stardust. At the very least, Bowie has called it Ziggy Goes to America, because I believe this was written during or after his US tour. Probably in the midst of it. And though it has very much the glam theatrics, in a sense, of Ziggy Stardust, it takes them in a fairly different direction. Whereas Ziggy Stardust was quite powerful, brash, young in a sense, Aladdin Sane is a little more calculating, somewhat intelligent, somewhat thinking. There's quite a lot more self-reflection in the lyrical themes, such as in the song Time, or at the very least the atmosphere of Lady Grinning Soul gives the atmosphere, and there is also a fair bit of additional experimentation on it. My favorite track on it would have to be the title track itself, which not only is quite an ominous song, considering the contrast between the subdued verses and somewhat off-kilter chorus, but also has an amazing piano solo on behalf of Mick Garson. But there are also some very good, more straightforward glam rock numbers, such as Panic in Detroit, Watch That Man. The Gene Genie is also a fairly popular song on that album, but personally I've never found it among the top ranks of the Bowie canon. Well, to be fair, there is a lot of competition. But let's put it this way, Hunky Dory and Ziggy Stardust, those are 9s out of 10. Aladdin Sane, I consider that in more of an 8 out of 10. Nevertheless, quite a good album. If you like Ziggy Stardust and Hunky Dory, which would probably be the strongest entry points into Bowie, at least for this era, I highly recommend Ziggy Stardust as your first album. If you like these, Aladdin Sane is sure to deliver. Now, this was in 1973, and a little after that, he would deliver his final performance as Ziggy Stardust, and it has been recorded and released as Ziggy Stardust the Motion Picture. The soundtrack to the motion picture being the performance itself. And at that point in time, actually, some people thought that it was the end of David Bowie altogether, but on the contrary, it was the end of the Ziggy Stardust character, and this would set the tone for what much of David Bowie's career would look like. Simply put, that was the point where the seeds of the musical chameleon would take shape. Part of the interest in David Bowie's discography is that he would assume multiple different identities, personalities, and characters. Ziggy Stardust is the most recognizable one, and the most explicit character as well. But I would argue that almost every album of his has some sort of character to it, at least in the sense that every album has a distinct sort of overall mood and tone, which can be personified in a certain character. For example, his 1969 self-titled album, I'd almost argue it takes up the general character of Major Tom, in the sense that Space Oddity has a general feel of surreal melancholy, and that feeling permeates itself throughout most of the material. It's a very quiet, somber, somewhat, a little bittersweet, I would say. And you could argue this for almost every single album in his catalog, except for one, which I'll get to later. But yes, David Bowie's Ziggy Stardust character was laid to rest. But before we would get to his next full-fledged albums, we would get Pin-Us, which is more or less just a set of covers from various artists that he likes. These include Pink Floyd, he covered the numbers See Emily Play, and there's also a cover of a Kinks song, more specifically, Where Have All the Good Times Gone? Just give me a sec. Okay, my computer's not on fire. But it's not exactly particularly interesting, honestly. The performances are good, but they're just straightforward, and I don't know. I already have some reservations about the peak of his glam period. What do you think a bunch of covers from in his glam style are gonna do with me? I mean, it's possible to do excellent covers, but this ain't exactly Tiny Tim doing Fill Your Heart, or I don't know. I'm trying to think of a better example than the obvious Jimi Hendrix. Nah. Nine Inch Nails version is better, honestly. Anyways, that is neither here or there. Now we get into the next era, which turned out to be another fucking glam album, Diamond Dogs. David Bowie's Diamond Dogs. Now, I'll say this, I have a lot more reservations about this than I do with Aladdin Sane. Originally, this was planned to be a concept album based directly on 1984, and while many of the dystopian thematics would stick around, there would have to be a bunch of changes because I believe the Orwell estate didn't agree with this, or at least didn't give Bowie the approval of it. And it's a very uneven affair. On one hand, you have the 2 years that have happened since Ziggy Stardust might have done some good, because in terms of production, I would say it's quite a bit of a meteor album when it comes to the heavy glam tracks. Personally, I fucking love the title track Diamond Dogs. It's got a lot of punch, a lot of groove, and I also love a lot Rebel Rebel, the obvious hit from this record. Though that being said, that depends on the remaster you have. There have been a lot of remasters of this album. Not all of them are that good. Personally, I think the best one I've heard so far was actually the 2016 remaster for Bowie's compilation box set, Who Can I Be Now? At the moment, they are releasing every year box set compilations of specific eras of David Bowie's history. In 2015, we had 5 years which retraced the material from, I believe, Space Oddity up until Pinups or Aladdin Sane or something. The second one was in 2016 called Who Can I Be Now, which goes from Diamond Dogs to Station to Station. 2017, A New Career in a New Town, which retraces most of his Berlin era material, more specifically from Low to Scary Monsters and Super Creeps. And the one we had last year was Loving the Alien, which retraces his fairly maligned mid-80s material from Let's Dance in 1983 to Never Let Me Down in 1987, with oddities, odds and ends, singles, and sort of novelties in each box set. And I believe the remaster from Who Can I Be Now may actually be my favorite so far. There was a 30th anniversary 2-CD remaster in, I think, 2003. I don't know if I've already said that. And it is quite meteoric, but compared with the Who Can I Be Now remaster, it's not a... I don't know, it's a little too rough. Perhaps a little too loud in this word, if you get what I'm saying. I would probably recommend the Who Can I Be Now remaster, or maybe the 1989 Ryko disc master. These, I believe, are fairly common, or at the very least, they have been the latest CD master for quite a while that wasn't remastered. Anyways, it's quite an uneven album. I prefer the first side a lot better to the second. The first side has a fair amount of pretty good songs. Definitely Rebel Rebel and Diamond Dogs are certainly the two best songs on there. But there's also the 3-song suite of Sweet Thing, Candidate, and the reprise of Sweet Thing. I do prefer the first part of the 3, but the entire suite does make a pretty nice whole. It's mainly in the second half that problems begin to come up. I don't know about you, but Rock and Roll With Me is easily one of his most flaccid ballads in his 70s material. And that fucking says a lot, because it's still a pretty good song. But in comparison to some of the amazing stuff he had released before and after, it doesn't fucking hold a candle. Not even close. And the same thing goes for We Are the Dead, fairly flaccid. But it does pick up a bit with 1984, this out of nowhere groovy funk disco rocker. And there's also Big Brother with its imposing chorus that I quite like a bit. It took a little time to grow on me, but I do like it a lot. But still, for all of this inconsistency, and for the fact that the only two real classics are Diamond Dogs and Rebel Rebel, I would definitely put it in the essential but I don't like it as much category, because it is still, it's David Bowie doing 1984, glam 1984. It's really something. Now we get into something interesting. Now, for the moment, I've mostly been discussing David Bowie in the studio. But for many of these albums, he would have his own live tour. Not every album has gotten a live tour, but for most of these albums that did get tours, these tours have had something interesting to them. Now, I've mostly glossed over the Ziggy Stardust tour, which has been fairly straightforward. It's David Bowie being out there in all his flamboyant costumes and performing in front of the people. But the Diamond Dogs tour was, on the other hand, quite interesting. It was meant to be quite a very, elaborate theatrical presentation with, I believe, with elaborate sets. But that ultimately didn't turn out well. There were a lot of technical problems that happened but unfortunately, there's nothing I can say much in the heat of the moment. I'm improvising this. But it suffered from a lot of technical problems. Also, as you can hear in what was then his first live album, David Live, he was actually doing more or less soulified versions of his material. For instance, he would perform the title track of Aladdin Sane quite a number of times, and it had a much more distinct soul vibe to it, including among others a saxophone replacing the piano part, or at least accompanying it when it comes to the main melody. And what would ultimately happen is that he would take a break in the middle of the tour, and by the time he would get back, the Diamond Dogs tour had turned into the Soul tour. And by that point, during that break, he actually composed a couple of songs that he would perform during the Soul tour. Unfortunately, we don't have any official recordings of most of the performances based on these songs. They are available on bootlegs, but all we have is the 2017 live album Cracked Actor, which is an official release of a fairly popular bootleg from September 1974, called Strange Fascination. But the only song that would only appear in the studio afterwards was the closing track, John, I'm Only Dancing Again, which was a funk redoing of a song he had done in 1971-72 called John, I'm Only Dancing, and I found this reworking quite a lot better. It's an amazing funk rave up that lasts a whole 7 minutes. It's great. But nevertheless, most of the other performances have yet to be released on official live performances, but they include songs such as Fascination, I believe, Win, Right, I don't think Right actually, Somebody Up There Likes Me, and most importantly, a song called Young Americans, and that is precisely what the next album would be. Actually, I would probably put it in It's Alright, rather. Young Americans was the beginning of David Bowie's funk soul period, or what he liked to call it blue-eyed soul, because he was a white limey that was doing soul music. But self-deprecation aside, it is his full-fledged soul album, Soul and Funk. And once again, like with Diamond Dogs, it's quite a bit of an uneven record. There are two obvious major singles. There is the title track, an excellent, swelling sort of mini epic, because I think the studio version clocks in at like 6 minutes. An excellent song. And there's also the imposing funk tune, Fame, that closes out the album, and which initially, during the Soul Tour, was performed as Foot Stompin', but ended up being changed afterwards. In fact, you can see a performance on YouTube on the Dick Cavett show of David Bowie doing Foot Stompin'. But aside from the two of these, there aren't that many songs in between that are particularly well known or that good. Though then again, it's another situation where nothing is that great, but everything is at least pretty good. For instance, there's another ballad right after Young Americans that's called Win, which I do like quite a bit. It has a very nice almost ethereal atmosphere at some parts of the track. But probably the bigger highlights in between the two major singles would be another funk rave up, Fascination, but most importantly, this sort of epic number, Somebody Up There Likes Me, that clocks in at 6.5 minutes, a very imposing opener of the second half of the record. There's also, probably the worst song on there is the cover of Across the Universe from the Beatles. And actually, John Lennon performs in not just Across the Universe, but also the closing song Fame. Regardless, I wasn't a fan of Across the Universe in the first place, so while I do respect Bowie's performance, it's still pretty good. it's not something I would really go out of the way to listen to any other day of the week. So once again, another inconsistent album, and one that I would feel fairly comfortable putting in the It's Alright category, because aside from the title track and Fame, it's not that well known of an album. Now, this is the point where shit really gets fucking real. I haven't mentioned this, but since the early 1970s, Bowie has been having a cocaine problem. A major one. And about this point, in 1976, it would get out of fucking control. The stories have already been told plenty of times about David Bowie thinking witches were going to steal his semen, or that Jimmy Page was going to assassinate him, that he was living off a diet of milk and bell peppers or something. In any case, 1976, David Bowie was not fucking doing well. But judging from his music, you couldn't fucking tell. Because Station to Station, an album that he doesn't even fucking remember recording, that's what cocaine does to you, may be his best album. Now, I'm gonna skip ahead a bit. My favorite David Bowie album is Heroes. It's right here. And I consider Heroes to be among my top 10, if not my top 3 favorite albums of all time. I've listened to over 5,000 albums, and this stands at the top. But recently, I'm starting to get the feeling that Station to Station might actually be better than Heroes. And this is not an album I can easily unpack just like that. Alright, I'm gonna put this in a somewhat unhelpful way. It's like a mix of krautrock, funk, soul, and prog. And it's absolutely batshit fucking insane when you consider the other music that was coming out at the time. I can go at it track by track. The opener, Station to Station, is a 10-minute epic that starts off with a somewhat calm and ominous 4-minute section, then explodes into a massive closing funk rave. There's Golden Years, a very imposing, probably the most straightforward number on the album, a very simple funk rock tune. And there's also TBC-15, a very dainty, almost sometimes like saloon piano type ditty based on a story of Iggy Pop, one of his friend musicians. You might know him from his solo career or from his work with the Stooges, the proto-punk band The Stooges, of a story of a hallucination that Iggy Pop had where his TV ate his girlfriend. And there's also another great funk rave up in Stay. But what took me a lot of time to grow on me were the 2 ballads that closed each half of the record. The final track is Wild is the Wind, which was I don't know who are the exact writers, but the only reference what I can give you is that in 1966, Nina Simone would have had done her own version of it. And personally, I actually prefer this one. It's a very emotionally powerful sort of closer. But what I mostly want to discuss is the song that closes out the first side, Word on a Wing. Now, in a 1999 performance that David Bowie gave on a show called VH1 Storytellers, where I believe the principle is to tell a little bit about the context of each and every song you're playing on the show, on his performance in VH1 Storyteller, I believe he closed out with Word on a Wing, and he explained that at that point, the mid-1970s, were his darkest moment. And he had actually written Word on a Wing as a sort of cry for help. And when you have that in mind, the song quickly goes from great to absolutely fucking heartbreaking. It's a very emotional number. It's more or less David Bowie calling out to some sort of God and looking for a guidance in his life. He was completely lost at this point in time. Now, I'm only embellishing the songs themselves with the context around them, the lyrical themes, because I'm not able to give you a thorough description of the music itself. though ideally I would do that because I believe in a sense, the sound of the lyrics are more important than the meaning of the lyrics themselves. But unfortunately, I have to deal with the measures on board. After all, this is just a fucking stupid tier maker tier list. But nevertheless, it's a great album. Every song on it is a classic, and that's a big reason why I'm almost considering it's better than Heroes. Because even with that, I can say, oh, there's one song that is maybe not quite as good as the rest, but not station to station. Every single song bangs on all cylinders. I consider it absolutely essential. It's crazy. You need to fucking buy it. 10 out of 10. Now, we get to the Berlin era. It's somewhat of an inaccurate term, but in late 1976, Bowie decided to curb his problem with cocaine, and he decided to move to Germany, more specifically, I believe, Berlin, where he would live with his pal Iggy Pop, who also wanted to kick his coke addiction, because according to Bowie, heroin was a bigger problem in Germany, and he didn't really give a shit about that. So for a while, the two of them were living in Berlin, and it was there that the two of them, or at least around that point in time, because they would not record all of the albums they would record at that point in Germany. But it was around that point in time that they recorded a lot of their better albums. For instance, Bowie worked with Iggy Pop in writing the music for Pop's first two albums, generally considered to be his best, The Idiot and Lust for Life. And I highly recommend the two of them, though they are quite different brands of Iggy Pop. The first one is a somewhat industrial art rock album with elements of krautrock, and Lust for Life is a more straightforward rock and roll album that recalls more the material that he would have done with. It's a little closer to the material that he had done with the Stooges in the early 70s, though still quite a bit far away. Lust for Life is not exactly ultra powerful proto-punk like Fun House or Raw Power was. So I recommend the two of those as well. But on David Bowie's end, he would also begin collaborating with, at that point, an already legendary, or at least in terms of his output, an already legendary artist, Brian Eno, who at that point in time had not only worked with the also fairly revolutionary glam rock, art rock band Roxy Music, but had also done his own solo art rock albums. Here Comes the Warm Jets, his debut, is a masterpiece of dense production work. Brian Eno is an absolute keynote production worker, and quite capable of making his own amazing songs as well. And at that point in time, he had already begun laying a lot of foundations for ambient music. Ambient music had already existed at that point in the early 70s with acts like Vangelis, which you may know for the Blade Runner soundtrack, and Tangerine Dream, an experimental German electronic band that would also do ambient soundscapes. But it was probably Brian Eno that mainly solidified the concept of ambient music as sort of soothing soundscapes to be put in the background for background listening. So at that point in time, Brian Eno had already done quite a few albums, quite a few excellent ones as well. Honestly, I'd be interested in doing a tier list of him as well. So he decided to work with David Bowie. Now, his influence may be overstated when it comes to the following three albums, Low, Heroes, and Lodger. But he did have an impact on them. But I guess it should be noted that Tony Visconti was the producer for all three of those, if memory serves me well. But regardless, Low is another amazing album, an absolute classic. That one is undeniably essential. It's generally considered one of his best, almost more or less up there with Hunky Dory. But popular opinion, it's not quite easy to determine. But nevertheless, it's a masterful album, and one of two halves actually. The first one is somewhat straightforward. It's a comparatively straightforward collection of electronically enhanced art pop and art rock pieces. Electronically enhanced because the drumming performed by Dennis Davis, an excellent drummer. It has a slight electronic synthesized touch to it that adds to the sort of mechanical downbeat atmosphere of the record. There are some fairly uplifting numbers, such as the brilliant opening instrumental Speed of Life, or I guess you could say Sound and Vision is somewhat uplifting, but Low is very much influenced by Bowie's experience with the cocaine at that point in time. Low is quite an accurate term. He was feeling low. He was dealing with sort of the consequences of his addiction and was just trying to power through it. And the end result is that some of the songs are fairly downbeat and somewhat morose. But the first side is still quite an excellent collection of wonderful tunes. My favorite from the first side would be Speed of Light, but Sound of Vision, generally the most popular song on there, is quite excellent, is very excellent as well. And I would also say perhaps the imposing rocker Breaking Glass is quite a highlight as well as Always Crashing in the Same Car, which is the most revelatory when it comes to his state of mind at the time. And finally, there's another instrumental, A New Career in a New Town, with an excellent soulful harmonica part that closes things out. But another reason why the record is so interesting is because the second half is occupied entirely by more or less instrumental ambient pieces from David Bowie, the guy who 5 years before that had done Ziggy, Stardust, and the Spiders from Mars, comparatively a much more accessible album. And not only that, these ambient pieces aren't just, novelty experimentation. They are some extremely convincing pieces. Some of the most popular piece of the second half is Warzawa, based more or less pretty much based on the sort of, I don't know if it was that devastating, but it is very much inspired by the city of Warsaw in the aftermath of World War II, and it's an extremely downbeat and depressing number. It's crushing in a sense in its atmosphere, and there are a bit of vocals, but it's not exactly vocals. It's more the lyrics in themselves are gibberish, but even with the gibberish lyrics, the vocal performance adds to the melancholy of the atmosphere. In comparison, the other numbers aren't quite as atmospherically pronounced, but they are still quite good as well. I especially like Art Decade. It's got a bit of a sort of a scholarly, reflective tone to it. And I also like the closer Subterraneans, which is comparatively not so much depressing as it is very ominous, and that's that. Once again, an essential album, one that is very particular because of its dichotomy between a pop rock first side and a pop and an ambient second half. And this formula would actually continue on the following album, Heroes, which for the moment is my favorite album of his. But, Station to Station might very well be a good contender to take its place. Simply put, it's the sequel to Low. The principle is the same. First half is rock, second half is ambient. But it does both even better. And this time around, instead of... If Low was David Bowie dealing and struggling with the aftermath of his cocaine consumption, it's him, at least through the music, triumphing over it. The rock half is a lot more explosive and uplifting than Low's was, and this ambient second half, well, there's one song that is rock it closes out with a rock song on the second half, but the ambient suite in the second half is a bit more, well, it's also a little bit downbeat, but there's the third part of it, Moss Garden, is absolutely marvelous. It's a marvelous, peaceful tune where I believe Bowie plays the koto, a Japanese folk instrument, on it. It's marvelous. But yes, it's a lot more explosive and vibrant, ironic considering the cover is in black and white compared to Low's colored cover. And it has perhaps his most famous songs, or at least in his top 3 most famous songs, and potentially his greatest song of all time, the title track. I don't think I need to add anything about it. It stood the test of time. It's undeniably a classic. The hype is absolutely justified because you really feel it really feels like a triumph. When I listen to it, I feel, yeah, I'm fucking doing it. It's amazing. But there are also quite a few numbers worthy of interest. There is the opening Beauty and the Beast, which has a bit of a funk undertone to it, but not quite as much as, say, on Station to Station or Young Americans. Nevertheless, but there is also Joe the Lion, a much heavier rocker. There's also Blackout, which is quite a rock-based song. And the one song that I would consider very slightly weaker than everything else is Sons of the Silent Age, which has a comparatively somewhat slow verse, and then goes into a chorus. I don't know how to describe the chorus. It's a bit of a show tune chorus. It's a very theatrical chorus, and I don't know, the dichotomy between the verses and the chorus doesn't work quite as well as the rest of the material. Now, the ambient suite on side 2 is quite excellent. It's based, I believe, once again, it's based on more or less on Germany during World War II. It's got a bit of a storytelling progression to that. There is, it opens with V2 Schneider, a bit of a sort of minimalist rocker with definitely very few lyrics, but a very standard rock melody core that it expands about quite well because of the warped sound effects surrounding it, and the horns that complement the central core. It closes. I'll leave. That's as much as I'll say for the ambient suite. But it also closes out on another funk number, Secret Life of Arabia, another excellent song, and one that would foreshadow the album that would follow, Lodger. Now, I should mention. Let's wait a second. Now, I should mention, Low, Heroes, and Lodger are considered to be part of the Berlin Trilogy. But this is a bit of a misnomer, more or less a bit of a lie, just to better market the albums in a sense, considering they were a lot more experimental than Bowie's prior outputs. But in reality, the main thematic link between the three is that Bowie has made them in collaboration with Brian Eno. And for a while, Lodger would actually be his last album done in collaboration with him. But that is the main link, because in reality, not all of these albums were recorded in Germany. I believe that Low was recorded in part in France or in Switzerland. Only David Bowie's album, Only Heroes, would be fully recorded in Berlin at the Hansa Studio, recorded, which was located, in fact, in front of the Berlin Wall, and it was partially because of the location that Bowie would get the inspiration for the song Heroes, because in either case, Lodger would be the final part of the Berlin Trilogy. Now, it's a bit hard to say. I would say it would be hard to say the album is truly essential, or at least that it's considered essential globally. It's generally seen as the black sheep of the Berlin Trilogy, and it's definitely not as strong as the rest of the album, as the two other albums, but it's still a great record. It's fucking excellent. To put it simply, Bowie and Eno abandoned the rock on one side, ambient on the other side structure, and simply put, just go a little all over the place with a sort of experimentation there. There is a little bit of everything on Lodger. There are a bit of Arabic folk on Yassassin, an excellent song. There is some more straightforward art rock leanings on Look Back in Anger. There's a bit of sort of disco funk on The Closing Red Money, which is actually just a lyrically different version of Sister Midnight off of Iggy Pop's The Idiot. And there is also, let's see, what else is there? Oh, I guess there's also Boys Keep Swinging, which is a fairly straightforward rock number, but everyone in the band plays a different instrument than they normally do. And it's also probably the most whacked out number on there is African Night Flight. It's basically Death Grips before Death Grips, and I'm not fucking joking. Well, I'm exaggerating a bit, but it still really is Death Grips before Death Grips. It has a bit of it has a very percussive sort of musical backbone, and Bowie delivers a performance that is pretty close to rapping. Legitimately, listen to the song, the similarity is somewhat there. Now, it's another album with a lot of great songs. I like African Night Flight a lot. There's also the opening, very sort of somber, but also very soothing, but also somewhat depressing, Fantastic Voyage, a very sweeping ballad, somewhat ballad. There's also the opener of side B, DJ, which is more or less Talking Heads. No, it's not before Talking Heads. That's 1979. Talking Heads were already well a thing at that point in time, but it is a very wacky sort of. It is a bit of an off-kilter, wacky little new wave tune, where David Bowie delivers a performance very comparable to David Byrne's sort of demented vocal personality in Talking Heads' earlier material. And there's also Look Back in Anger, that I consider a very strong rocker, probably my favorite on the album. I wouldn't consider it an essential album. It's not generally seen as one of his most influential releases. But that being said, I consider it a great album. If you like the other two parts of the Berlin Trilogy, I highly recommend it. Now, we now enter the 1980s, where David Bowie would actually experience a bit of a commercial revival. In the end, his the last three albums were somewhat successful. It did top the chart. It did reach fairly high in the charts in some countries, but they weren't exactly commercial powerhouses. And it was with Scary Monsters and Super Creeps that he would finally sort of remodel itself for the new wave era and put out a smash hit with the #1 single Ashes to Ashes, which, if you have listened to this song, makes direct reference to Major Tom. And that plays a bit of a role, and that sort of foreshadows one of the underlying themes of the record. It's a very demented, sort of unresting album. But what I find is a theme that runs through a couple of songs, mainly Ashes to Ashes and another song, Teenage Wildlife, is this sort of an acknowledgement that David Bowie wasn't exactly relevant in this, not exactly. It's not that he was irrelevant now, but it's more that he was no longer relevant and young like he was in the Ziggy Stardust era. Teenage Wildlife is a bit of an admission to that, and with Ashes to Ashes, it's like he's bringing back his past success with Space Oddity to say, all right, well, all this shit's happened, but this is no longer the present. And I will dare make a bold move. I do not like it as much as Station to Station, Low, and Heroes, but it comes dangerously close to being another 10 out of 10. All three of these previous albums are 10 out of 10. But I would dare putting it in that position because, at least for the first half, it's absolutely unanimously brilliant. There's the demented rocking opener, It's No Game, where Bowie just screams his fucking life out. There's also the title track, Scary Monsters and Super Creeps with a lot of drive. There's the morose Ashes to Ashes with a lot of particularities in its sound construction. There's the funky pseudo-fascist groove tune Fashion, and there's the opener of the second half, Teenage Wildlife, and a swelling mini epic, basically his heroes for the 1980s, where once again he delivers an amazing vocal performance. It gets tears in my eyes at the right moment in time. The big problem is that after Teenage Wildlife, it kind of peters off a bit. The songs after that are still quite good, and I do like quite a bit, a few of them, a lot. For instance, there is Scream Like a Baby, another very demented new wave track about political imprisonment. And there's also Because You're Young with once again a lot of drive, a lot of rock and drive. But there's a cover of Tom Verlaine of Television, the post-punk band Television, of his song Kingdom Come, which is, I don't know, not exactly... It's good, but it doesn't exactly stand out. It feels like something that could have been taken out, and the progression wouldn't have really been for the and the progression of the album wouldn't have really changed for the worst. I hesitate to call it filler on principle. It's a bit of a principle thing. And there's also the closing reprise of It's No Game Part 2, where well, the main change is that Bowie is a little quiet, more reserved in his vocal performance. In a way, I kind of like it, because the demented feel is there for almost the entire album, and suddenly he's all calm again. It's almost like he got fucking sterilized, and so he got reindoctrinated into this crazy world. That's a bit of an interpretation I had. It's actually an interpretation I had is that this album is Major Tom coming back to Earth and seeing all the changes and going fucking crazy until he becomes more or less complacent at the end. Once again, a great album. A great album with a lot of very well-known singles. Scary Monsters, Fashion, and Ashes to Ashes were all singles. Now, we enter David Bowie's much maligned pop phase in the mid-80s. It's worth noting that up until this point, Bowie had been contributing almost consistently with producer and sometimes instrumentalist Tony Visconti. But it was on the 1983 album Let's Dance that this I was about to say companionship, that this partnership would would break for almost 2 decades. Simply put, David Bowie intentionally wanted to make a pop album. He wanted to make a pop album with some major fucking hits. And he had decided that instead of recruiting Tony Visconti, he would actually enlist the help of quite well-known pop producer and funk producer Nile Rodgers, who was in the band Chic until that point in time. I don't remember if he was still in Chic at that point in time in 1983. But he came up to him, he showed him like a picture of a guy riding a sports car and was like, I want this album to sound like this. In either case, he intentionally wanted an album of hits. It wasn't exactly something I would call a selling out album. It was more of in a sense, he was less interested in the money, but more in the music that made money. Because this album that was not produced with Tony Visconti, but by Nile Rodgers, which I would consider great but not essential, because, I'll get into that in a moment, is a very slick but very effective pop album. In ways, it is very characteristic and typical of a pop album of the era. Punchy drumming, electronic instrumentation, synthesizers, but it also has quite a few idiosyncrasies that make it stand out as well. The most notable of these is the funk bent to a lot of the material, but also the blues bent, because the lead guitar on many of these songs was played by Stevie Ray Vaughan. At that point in time, one of the big names of electric blues up until his death in 1991 or 1990, I believe. So he enlisted the help of Stevie Ray Vaughan to play guitar on many of these songs, and his presence, when you know he's on there, you're gonna recognize him easily, because his blues licks that are also, that have been passed through the clean production, but in a way the cleanliness of the guitar tone, it gives it a very sharp diamond-like quality. You can hear those blue licks. They are very distinctive and they work. Now, that being said, the 3 most popular numbers on there are the singles, and they are all unanimously excellent. There is Modern Love, a very driving and energetic rock tune about going to the church on time. There is China Girl, his first of multiple Iggy Pop covers, not all of which were successful, but his first Iggy Pop cover. Now, that being said, I say that being said a lot. Now, I should mention that this was a number that he co-wrote with Iggy Pop as well. It appeared on The Idiot as well. It was a number that he had written in collaboration, but nevertheless it was a radical reinterpretation as well. The original song is more or less is a bit of a demented ballad that is in part an ode to a Vietnamese woman that Iggy Pop knew, but also it could also be interpreted as a critique of American imperialism. And in either case, whether that latter part is quite true or not, Iggy Pop's version was very demented, and I prefer it slightly in part because of that, because he delivers a great, crazy vocal performance. And in comparison, David Bowie's version is a lot more slick and a lot more suave, but it works very effectively. And finally, there is the title track, this major 8-minute dance tune. My favorite on the album, one with a lot of soul, a lot of groove. I'm the kind of guy who likes extended dance mixes a lot, so the studio version is a godsend. Now, the problem is, the album never really reaches the soaring heights of the first 3 tracks. There are a lot of very good songs. I like the ballad Without You, which only lasts 3 minutes, and in some ways is a bit maudlin, but, you know, with these 3 big tunes, it closes out the first side in a very desirable way. And there's also a very strong rocker near the end of the album, Cat People Putting Out Fire, which is a much more energetic and once again rocking version of a song that he had done for the soundtrack of Cat People, the movie of the same name. The soundtrack version is quite a bit different and a lot slower in its progression. It starts off very quietly. But this new version is also very good as well, with possibly Stevie Ray Vaughan's best solo on the album. But the rest of the songs are not quite as good. I don't particularly like Ricochet that much. I find it very mechanical. Colonel Ward is pretty nice. Shake It is kind of fucking stupid, honestly. It feels a little dumb compared to the other songs. It's a bit like a Prince pastiche, but not with as much sexual energy as Prince. But I also like it as well. But consequently, most people know this album for the first 3 songs. These are the 3 songs that they remember. And consequently, it's not seen as an essential album. And I would not quite consider it an essential album. But especially because a lot of people don't like the remaining 5 songs that much as well. But I would still consider it a borderline great album. It's a very good record. Now we get into David Bowie's worst album by far, Tonight. This is the point where we reach David Bowie's lowest point. Well, he had already reached a pretty low point in Station to Station when it came to his personal life, but he will reach another low point in his personal life. Simply put, he was intentionally trying to go for the sound of hit singles in Let's Dance, but it worked a little too well. He was now a worldwide sensation. He was playing to packed concerts and arenas. I'm pretty sure there is a video cassette of a live show during this tour, the Serious Moonlight Tour. Probably one of his best music tours. There's a bootleg of his second night in Montreal, and it's absolutely fucking amazing. It's honestly one of his best live performances with an excellent set list, excellent performers. A lot of the performances are fairly straightforward, but he covers a lot of ground considering this was his major sort of pop breakthrough. There are songs from Low, a little all over the place. I think there is also... He even plays a song from Lodger, more precisely Red Sails, another great track from that album as well. But he hadn't expected that success, and he wasn't sure who his audience was anymore. And that became a bit of a problem, because he got spooked. He started to think, oh no, I need something to satiate, to keep this new audience I've acquired satisfied. And that laid the groundwork for the biggest mistake in his career, and that is Tonight. This album was rushed. It was not rushed in the recording. It took actually more time than Let's Dance did. But it was rushed in the songwriting. Out of everything he has written on Tonight, he has only written 2 songs. The rest were either covers of songs that he had done with Iggy Pop, or material that he co-wrote with Iggy Pop for the album, or other people. I believe there was one that he co-wrote with Iggy Pop and Carlos Alomar, another longtime contributor of his, who would play guitar in a lot of his albums. An excellent guitarist as well. And the end result is that it's a lot more so than Hunky Dory is. I've said that album is inconsistent, but compared to Tonight, Hunky Dory is station to station levels of consistency. But it's a very inconsistent album. And one that, unlike almost everything on there, is difficult to associate with a particular character or overall concept. Because there is a bit of a concept, but it's very half-baked. After a bit of thought, I would consider it sort of a travel log. A lot of songs are based on either traveling around multiple places or the struggles of the clash between cultures. For instance, the final song, Dancing with the Big Boys, is about immigrants making a living in New York City. Or, for instance, Loving the Alien is a song about religious warfare. So there is an overarching theme of cultural clash. And to sort of convey this, there's a bit of a mix of multiple different styles on there. More specifically, there is a lot of reggae in this album. And it's... on one hand, I do quite like the sound on there. It's quite a very clean and somewhat more subdued, less rock-based sound than Let's Dance was. But simply put, the songwriting is simply not up to snuff. There are two great songs on there. Loving the Alien, a very atmospheric mini-epic with a brilliant closing solo and an excellent progression. And there's also Blue Jean, a fairly mechanical hit tune, but one that has a lot of groove and also has a very nice assortment of xylophones, or at least I think they are xylophones, or at least or possibly marimbas, and horns to complement this the rock core. These two are great songs, but they are also the only songs that Bowie wrote on his own. And that's a shame, because everything else is a lot worse. I don't think I should torture you with going through every song on there. Let's just say, out of everything else there, the only songs that are fairly pleasant are his version of "Don't Look Down," an Iggy Pop number on his from his release New Values in 1979, and I also think his covers of the Beach Boys' "God Only Knows" and of the rock standard "I Keep Forgetting" are pretty good. But it's more that you really need to try you really need to make an attempt to try and ruin "God Only Knows." And "I Keep Forgetting" it actually works quite well with the sort of driving pace of the performance. But the rest is listenable. I have listened to this album many times in full and did not feel any displeasure. But some of the songs are pretty embarrassing, especially probably his version of "Tonight," which had appeared on Iggy Pop's "Lust for Life." The original version was more or less a lullaby to a dying crack addict, but the opening monologue that adds this context is removed from Bowie's version, and the result is a very, in a sense, it's kind of pleasant as a nocturnal, subdued reggae number, but on the other hand, it's completely flaccid and Tina Turner performs in that song. She gives vocals, but it's completely flaccid. Granted, it's not even the worst song on there. There's another song, "Neighborhood Threat," another Iggy Pop cover from "Lust for Life." That it's a complete clusterfuck. There is somewhat of a core melody, but it's covered up by a whole bunch of other attempts at giving hooks that it feels extremely disjointed. Now, fortunately, Bowie would take more time to plan out his next album. The thing is, however, he would use he would mention that his biggest inspiration for the direction he would take in the future was the closing track of Tonight, Dancing with the Big Boys. It is somewhat of a similar style as Neighborhood Threat, in that it is a it's a densely packed song with a somewhat subdued main hook, but a lot of flourishes, whether instrumental or vocal, that are packed onto the core, which gives it the impression of being very, very chaotic at first. But when you peel back the layers, you start to recognize, oh, there are a lot of nice little tidbits here and there. I think Dancing with the Big Boys is a bit of a clusterfuck as well, but I honestly quite like that song. And also the extended dance mix is actually it boggles my mind that a song that isn't particularly good in a 3-minute form actually turns out better in a 7.5-minute form. It surprises me. So it would actually take inspiration from that for his next album. But this album is pretty much the record that almost broke him. And that album is Never Let Me Down, and this one is gonna be controversial. I would almost dare put it up here. I am not joking. This is almost unanimously considered to be David Bowie's worst album, but I seriously love it. Well, you know what, just to be contrary, I'm gonna put it here. I'm not joking. But let's give a little bit of context as to why this is so despised. Simply put, it is all of the biggest excesses of 1980s productions turned to 11. It's not just a dense album. It's densely packed with a lot of instrumental sounds that are a little embarrassing. Not only is there large booming program percussion, not organic percussion, program percussion, there are also a whole bunch of flourishes and sort of MIDI instruments that occasionally make the songs kind of tacky. There are 2 songs on there that actually have MIDI clapping. It's impossible not to recognize. And there are also occasionally some synthesized horns. It sounds very plastic. It sounds very artificial. And here's the thing: I could understand why someone who isn't really big on overdone 80s synthesized production, I can understand why someone who isn't into that will hate this album. But probably, in comparison to a lot of people, I am a lot more tolerant of this type of material. So consequently, I was a bit more indulgent towards that album. And what ultimately happened is that it went from, kind of good, it was alright, but what I found is that I've listened to it more and more. I would keep listening to one song or another, like for instance the opening Day in Day Out, and over time I would notice more and more small hooks. There would always be a little bit of instrumentation here or there that isn't quite noticeable, that isn't overemphasized, but when you notice it, I realized, wow, it's kind of catchy. For instance, in the second verse of the opening Day in Day Out, under all the nearly industrial percussion and flourishes and Bowie's vocals telling the story of a woman trying to feed her child and trying to go for everything, even becoming a prostitute to try and pay the rent. I noticed this after some time. I noticed in the start of the second verse this very excellent bouncing piano line that continues up until the rest of the song, but is never brought that much to the forefront. It's an album with a lot of facets, but it's an extremely dense album, and when you listen to it the first time, it's a mess. It really sounds like a mess. It's almost comical how messy, overwrought, and over-bombastic it is. And the thing is that at that point, Bowie was absolutely not sure of himself. He said in an interview in 1995 that in the mid-80s, he felt like he had really lost his way. He felt that he was no longer making music for himself, but for his audience. And simply put, he did not have the heart in it anymore. He didn't like this album very much, like 10 years on. But he would say that the problem is not so much with the songs as with the production, and I would be inclined to agree. A lot of the songs there are seriously they are already, as they are, very good, if not borderline great. But the problem is that sometimes the production is just too much. It's too much. It's too dense. It's too tacky. It's something that could work with possibly more organic rock instrumentation, because this was meant to be his return to rock. And strictly speaking, it wasn't more of a rock album than Tonight, but it was not rock in the same way that Ziggy, Stardust, or Heroes was. It was a much more artificial brand of rock, and it certainly made it unique, but I can understand why for some it didn't necessarily make it good. And supposedly, while the songs were good, he left other people to do the meat of the production work. And it's a bit of a shame that this is the case, because for a bit of time, I honestly thought he was intentionally trying to pull a practical joke. That in his moment of lowest self-esteem, he would intentionally make something excessively 80s, excessively overwrought, to sort of get back at the music industry because of his newly found fame, which he ultimately didn't really want, which only made him feel worse about the material he was making. And part of the reason why I felt that is that, inexplicably, the lyrics often have a bit of a socio-political bent to them. Day in, Day Out touches upon poverty. Time Will Crawl is about the Chernobyl disaster. Zeros is a bit of an acknowledgement towards the 1960s and his inspirations there. There is even a sitar part, that recalls a bit of the psychedelic movement of the era. And I consider it one of the better songs on the record. It's a very nice anthemic tune with hooks aplenty, but I can say that about a lot of songs, including Day in, Day Out, Beat of Your Drum, Shining Star, Making My Love, which, aside from the MIDI clapping, honestly is a very, very nice ballad. And I guess the rocker New York still up. That's already 5 selected out of 11. There are a lot of songs on this album that I like quite a lot. And what else? There is Shining Star, Making My Love is another song. It's a song about the romance, but the backdrop in which it takes place is this city in the middle of social collapse with heroin going around. New York's in Love is a bit of a critique on somewhat of a bit of a critique on superstars, but take that with a grain of salt. And 87 and Cry is commentary on the Thatcher administration, the Margaret Thatcher administration. It's not exactly crass, but crass as in the punk band. It's not exactly crass in terms of social commentary, I'd say, but it's still something. And I thought this disconnect between the lyrical themes and the somewhat bombastic and upbeat instrumentation felt strange. So it's a bit of a shame that it turned out that the production decisions were mostly not his own. But c'est la vie. I don't know why I said that like that. I can actually speak French. C'est la vie. Oui, oui. But yes, it's a very strange but a very fascinating album. And I love a lot of songs on it. There are a lot of songs that I still play to this day. I see it play on my phone. I'm like, yes, I want to listen to it. It seriously happens. Only the last. It does wear itself a little bit thin in the last 3 tracks. 87 and Cry is quite good. Too Dizzy is quite good. Bang Bang, his last cover, more or less a bit of a final Iggy Pop cover for the road. And at least this time he went for a more obscure song, I suppose. It's a much more straightforward reinterpretation as opposed to the reggae reinterpretations of Tonight. But considering how embarrassing they were, it was probably better to be more safe in the reinterpretation decisions. But it does wear itself a little bit thin in the last 3 tracks. It could have done with a bit of trimming, considering the songs on the CD version last, on average like 5 minutes or something, 4 or 5 minutes. It's a pretty meaty album. That being said, another interesting tidbit. Two interesting tidbits. Too Dizzy is the only song in all of his albums that has been excised from future real releases. Even on the Loving the Alien box set, it does not appear. And I don't know, I don't really get why. It does sound like a fucking sitcom theme, but I have heard worse sitcom themes. It's a very nice song. I suppose the lyrics about, their lyrics more or less about infidelity. It's a guy who finds out his girl's been meeting another guy, and he's guy, who's this guy so I can beat his ass up? It's not exactly his best song, but I still like it. A bit of a shame, but if you want to listen to it, I guess you'll have to track down an original copy. I actually got myself a vinyl copy of the album. Very pleased with it. Final tidbit. The title track, Never Let Me Down, is dedicated to David Bowie's assistant, Coco Schwab, who had been his assistant since the early 70s and would remain as such until his death. And he would consider her his best friend. She was there, I believe, when Bowie was curbing his cocaine addiction in the late 70s. And when you consider the state of mind in which he was at that point in time, this ballad dedicated to her, which basically silently referring to her and going, "You've never let me down." He says that in the first chorus, and then in the second chorus he turns it back around and goes, "I'll never let you down." It's a very touching tribute to her. It's one of his most sincere moments, because I've seen a common criticism about Bowie's music is that he's always wearing a sort of mask, hiding behind a character. But in reality, a lot of these albums are a reflection of his state of mind at the time. For instance, Ziggy Stardust is arguably sort of wish fulfillment. It was a projection of his desire to be a superstar, a rock star. Station to Station and Low reflected his his astray state of mind as a result of his cocaine addiction. And Never Let Me Down in this specific song does do the same thing. In a way, it really does have... It's strange to say that this album, which is often considered to be the worst, actually has some sort of parallels with Station to Station, one of his most acclaimed releases. Nevertheless, I consider it's like a 7.5 out of 10, dangerously close to an 8 out of 10. I don't even like it as much as Let's Dance. It's not exactly as compact of a listening experience, but I have listened to it a lot more than a lot of albums on here that are almost definitely better. And that has to say something, which is why I am daring to put it in great but not essential instead of it's alright. Now, because the maker of this tier list is visibly a major scrub, they decided not to include Tin Machine. What Bowie decided to do after the poor reception, both commercially and critically, of Never Let Me Down, is that instead of, at that point in time, after release, he wanted to do something more experimental, but ultimately he decided to put his solo career on hold for a little bit. And as a result, he decided to form Tin Machine. It was more or less an alternative rock, hard rock group inspired by the likes of the Pixies, who featured members such as, probably the most notable of these is Reeves Gabrels, with whom he would collaborate many times in the 1990s and further on. And the point of Tin Machine was that instead of being the face of the band, of being the face of the project, David Bowie would be one of the members. Everyone would contribute a major amount to the material and the sound. And this sort of reasoning is what gave birth to one of Bowie's remarks saying, "Fuck you, I'm in Tin Machine." For the most part, Tin Machine has been relegated to a footnote in the history of Bowie's catalog. And somewhat understandably, their first album has quite a bit of good songs, like the title, like Tin Machine, Crack City, Heaven's in Here. But otherwise, it's I would consider it quite overlong. I much prefer the second album, which is actually even more overlooked, but is also a lot more diverse. Instead of being primarily hard rock with a tinge of blues, it would explore a lot more directions and a lot more and have a much punchier 90s rock sound. I like, for instance, the very punching one shot. There's also the ominous "You Belong in Rock and Roll," the folksy tune "Amlapora." But there are also a bit of a few clunkers. More specifically, two songs that were sung by the drummer. I think his name is Hunt Sellers, but I'm not quite certain. But the drummer would contribute. I believe it was the drummer. Well, one of the other members would do the vocals on two songs, which were, one of these is the 6 minute blues rocker Stateside, which is, a little bit generic. It's sort of a bit of a generic blues workout. And Sorry, a short ballad where the singer in question tries to, go for a very projecting voice tone and doesn't work very well. But otherwise, it's a good album, and I recommend it. The thing is, I don't know how easy it is to find. I don't think it's gotten a reissue in quite a while. But that's ultimately what Bowie decided to do, and it ultimately revitalized him when it came to his confidence in his output. He just needed to perform some blues rock songs with a few pals for a couple of years, from 1989 to 1991. Oh, and before we go too far from the David Bowie live tidbits, in 1987, in promotion of Never Let Me Down, he would go on the Glass Spider tour, which was in some facets a retread of the Diamond Dogs tour, where he would go for a very theatrical presentation with people playing roles on stage and a lot of choreography. It was perceived at the time as a rather tacky thing, and honestly, I haven't been quite able yet to watch a performance. I've been able to listen to a lot of bootlegs and official performances and officially released performances, but I have yet to see the full thing on video. But I consider it a very interesting sort of live tour, because this was even more of a pop phase than Let's Dance. And he would intentionally go for some songs that were not obvious selections. For instance, he would pick Sons of the Silent Age. He would do a very good, honestly, reworking of All the Madmen from The Man Who Sold the World. And on the whole, considering I can stomach the overbearing 80s production and booming drums quite well, I felt it was a very good live period. There is an officially released recording of a performance in Montreal once again, that was initially released alongside the DVD release of the Glass Spider video release, but the video is a different performance. It's a performance in Sydney, but it has gotten a vinyl and CD release independently following the release of the Loving the Alien box set, in which it also appeared. Once again, I find it a very good performance. The reinterpretations, as slight as they may be, and as much as they may be simply updates to the sound of the time, I like these updates of his classic back catalog quite a lot. There are a lot of good songs, and I think, honestly, it may contain his best live version of Heroes across every show. At the very least, it's his best edit down of the song, because he doesn't play the full. Because depending on the live tour, he doesn't play the full version of Heroes like on the studio album. But here he does a very fine job of cutting it down from 6 minutes to 5. It's brilliant. And if you want to look for a specific show, I would highly advise that you seek out his performance at Berlin in 1987 by the Berlin Wall, very close to the Berlin Wall. It is said, now, I'm not going to pretend that David Bowie somehow brought the Berlin Wall down. It includes a lot of factors, but supposedly when he performed, after his live performance in 1987 next to the Berlin Wall, in which he would perform Heroes, and somewhat after that, a riot broke out in East Berlin. I'm not sure if there were people like next to the wall listening in, but there were people close by, I believe. And the German Bureau of Immigration, or one of the German bureaus, following David Bowie's death, would actually commemorate him, saying that he had helped bring down the wall. So in a sense, if there's anything you can take out of the Glass Spider tour, it's that this performance may have potentially, is at the very least because of the context surrounding it, may be one of his most legendary live performances. And it's not not one that is necessarily talked about often, not remotely as often as his last Ziggy Stardust show. But unfortunately, we have yet to have an official live recording of the Berlin Wall performance, which is a shame. It is a very good show, and he also plays songs. It is also very early in the Glass Spider tour, so he plays songs that he would not play in the later stages, including the Montreal and Sydney performances. He plays, for example, Zeros, New York's in Love, and Dancing with the Big Boys. And by the time we got into the second half of the tour, he would stop playing them altogether. Now, another live footnote: between the release of Tin Machine 1 and 2, the two albums, David Bowie would go on the Sound Plus Vision tour. Another very good tour. If you want to seek out bootlegs, I highly recommend this one as well. There are a lot of good performances. One of the better ones will probably be the performance at Milton Keynes. But I think there are some more that are also very good. There's a performance at Rio, the performance in Montreal. I don't know what... I think it is a performance in Tokyo. I just know that the bootleg is called TVC 1991 or TVC 1990, something like that. But it was another excellent tour where he was playing most of his hits, including a song that he would write for an album by Adrian Belew, who had performed with Talking Heads and King Crimson, but also had his own solo career. It was a song he co-wrote with Adrian Belew called Pretty Pink Rose, which appears on Belew's album Young Lions in 1990. Another very good album. Bowie gives the vocals on there as well. So if you want that, if you want all the Bowie you can get Young Lions as well. He does 2 songs on there. Another great live tour to watch out for. Now, what happened after Tin Machine? Well, David Bowie got married. He had a wife, Angela Bowie, between 1970 and 1980. But in 1992, he would marry Iman Abdul Majid, I believe a supermodel, But either way, the two married, and for the first time in quite a while, we start to get the glimpse of David Bowie as a man satisfied with himself. And the end result would be an album that is, once again, not quite particularly well loved. It's considered to be one of his weaker releases as well. And it's called Black Tie, White Noise. Simply put, Bowie collaborates with Nile Rodgers once again. But this time, he's doing a lot more than just a pop funk album. He is doing an art pop dance album. This was released in 1993. And at this point, dance was all the craze. And once again, it is a bit of a victim to the production values of his time. But it's something that I consider very good as well. It's a good album, honestly. Once again, I think I tolerate the norms of 1990s dance music. And I consider the percussion on it, because it's a very percussive album, to be really cool. It's got a lot of touches of house music on there. And it has a lot of very good songs. I especially like You've Been Around, I Feel Free, a version of Cream's song I Feel Free, which is very different from Blue's original, but very uplifting and powerful. And there are plenty of other interesting experiments here and there. There's an instrumental called Palace Athena that is quite interesting as well, and which he would rework a while later, but we're not to that. We're not on that point yet. And I think the most famous song on Black Tie, White Noise is Jump They Say, which is dedicated more or less to David Bowie's brother or half-brother. I think that's as much as I'll say for now. There are some allusions to his wedding with Iman, more specifically with the opener and closer, The Wedding and the Wedding Song. The wedding song is basically the wedding, but with vocals. It's also a good song, but the album is a bit overlong. There are a few tracks that I could have been removed, like, I don't know, I think Miracle Goodnight. It's a pretty nice song, but it could have been removed. It's kind of a quaint little ballad. I Know It's Gonna Happen Someday. It's a cover of a Morrissey song. Never particularly liked that one that much, so we could have removed it as well. Don't Let Me Down and Down is another. Really, most of the ballads are that good. Don't Let Me Down and Down. I don't know. I like it a little better because it's so tacky. It's almost it almost loops back around to sincere. He delivers quite an emotional performance. As sort of a sleeper highlight, I want to point out Looking for Lester. Lester being Lester Bowie, not related to David Bowie, a trumpetist who would play on this album. It's a very nice little instrumental with a drum rhythm that may very well be taken from a Brian Eno album from 1991. The 1991 album is called Nerve Net, I believe, and the rhythm is very similar to the one from the first song of Nerve Net, Fractal Zoom. So listen to the Looking for Lester and then Fractal Zoom and tell me what you think. But otherwise, because it's overlong, it clocks in at almost an hour, I wouldn't call it great, and it's definitely not essential, so we're putting it here. Now, we're entering into a bit of an overlooked little piece of David Bowie history. It's called The Buddha of Suburbia. And I would put this here, but I would honestly, if I could somehow manage to call this essential, I would put it up there. It was, I believe the reason why it fell into what it is comparatively obscure compared to most of his albums is that it was originally Bowie composed the music for a fairly overlooked TV miniseries called The Buddha of Suburbia. And it's possible that this album was overlooked because it was billed as a soundtrack, but in reality, it's as much of a soundtrack as Queen's album A Kind of Magic was a soundtrack to Highlander. The songs, strictly speaking, are the same, but they were reworked into a studio context. So in reality, David Bowie's Buddha of Suburbia is as legitimate as any other Bowie album as a full-fledged studio project, and I consider it one of his best, better even than Ziggy Stardust, Hunky Dory, and it's almost up there with the likes of Scary Monsters. It's honestly like it's top 10, definitely. This one, Ziggy Stardust barely skips the top 10. It should really put into context just how much I love a lot of these albums. And it's a bit of a, think of it this way, it conserves the experimentation of the electronic experimentation of Black Tie White Noise, but adds in a layer of alternative rock and brings back the ambient experimentation of Low and Heroes. There are 2 ambient songs on there, and they may legitimately be 2 of the best tracks on there. The Mysteries is a mind-blowing 7-minute peaceful tune. Already, Bowie was capable of quite some soothing ambient atmospheres, for example with Moss Garden in Heroes, but with The Mysteries, it's clean, it's pure. And the same goes for Ian Fish UK Hair, the final song on there. It's a bit more ominous, but it's just as peaceful as well. It would probably be best for you to give it a listen to see. But there is, honestly, it is a three-pronged, full frontal masterpiece. There are great ambient tracks, but there are great electronic tracks as well. For instance, Dead Against It is borderline shoegaze. Borderline shoegaze with its dense rock atmosphere and electronic instrumentation. And of course, there are a lot of great rock tracks as well. The main 2 ones are the title track, which was the only single from the album, but also a very bittersweet and conclusive pseudo-ballad, Strangers When We Meet, which is more or less his Heroes for the 90s, in the same way that Teenage Wildlife was Heroes for the 80s. And it will reappear on the following album, Outside. Once again, if I could, I would put it here, but it is not quite as acclaimed as the rest. But honestly, it frustrates me. Fuck it, I'm putting it on there. Fuck everything, fuck everyone. There are albums on here. I think I like this one just a little better than this, but I'm gonna put it on there just because it's honestly one of his most daring albums in his entire discography. It's up there in terms of experimentation with Station to Station or Here or Low. There's a lot to unpack on there, so I'll try to make it fairly short because this video is already almost 2 hours long. Simply put, Brian Eno came back, and David Bowie decided to experiment with sort of a fictional cyberpunk, not exactly cyberpunk, but sci-fi noir setting with him, with a lot of improvised audio recordings and things of the sort. And this would originally gestate into a 3-track, 70-minute industrial experimental rock album called or at least nowadays referred to as the Leon Suite. That would have been part of, I believe, a 5-album suite, or at least multiple albums, about the world as it approaches the year 2000. The Leon Suites, and by extension Outside, are about a detective, Nathan Adler, who follows the traces of the murder of a young girl, a 13-year-old girl called Baby Grace Blue, who was assassinated by people who do art crime. I believe that's how they refer to it. In short, murder is perceived by these people as art, and he is trying to track the circumstances surrounding it. But Nathan Adler's main job is to figure out whether this is actually art or whether it should be thrown into trash. And the murder case, and the Leon Suites include multiple monologues from people, from not just Nathan Adler, but multiple people surrounding the case, including Baby Grace Blue. There's a small recording of her somewhere in the Leon Suites, and there are also other characters involved with the crime, including people such as with names such as Ramona A. Stone, and also the eponymous Leon, who I believe is the primary perpetrator of the murder. And yes, I do believe it's hard to tell through Outside, because the thing is that originally Bowie and Eno presented the Leon Suites to the record label, but they refused it because it was not commercial enough. And having listened to the Leon Suites, it is available out there as a bootleg. I highly recommend that you seek it out if you're interested in this. It is honestly the most fucked up thing that Bowie has ever made in his entire discography. Seriously, Outside is daring, but is nowhere near the same level as the Leon Suites. And I should note, it's 3 tracks over 70 minutes, but originally it was going to be 5 tracks almost lasting 2 hours, but they got rid of 2 songs. Unfortunately, I would have loved to listen to them. But in any case, due to the record label refusing the album, David Bowie decided to rework it into a more accessible release, one that was still quite experimental, but still fairly accessible. And the result was one Outside. One because there were supposed to be more albums, but unfortunately with David Bowie's passing, and things visibly just not moving along fast enough with Brian Eno, though I do remember that in the late stage of his life he was actually talking with Eno about it, I believe. But in any case, there were planned to be more, but they didn't happen, so this is all we get. A reworked, more accessible version of the Leon Suites. And whereas the Leon Suites were somewhat of a more industrial, somewhat jazz, sort of all-over-the-place prog experimental rock opus, Outside is much more rooted in industrial music. There are some full-frontal industrial tracks, such as The Heart's Filthy Lesson, a great song, by the way, the title track. You could also put in tracks such as I'm Deranged, which appeared in the David Lynch movie Lost Highway. We Prick You, another excellent song. Oh, yeah. Here's the thing. If you cut down a couple of songs, Outside would be out there would definitely be in the top 5 Bowie albums. There are a lot of songs that are 10 out of 10s, but it's a little too long. There are a few songs such as I Am With Name or No Control that I find a little subpar not on in general, they are still very good, but I consider subpar compared to the soaring heights of Outside, The Heart's Filthy Lesson, the jazz, the melancholic jazz song that turns industrial that is called The Motel that lasts 7 minutes. The 4 final tracks, including the ominous, imposing, anxious, We Prick You, the desperate, I'm Deranged, the actually uplifting sounding Through These Architects' Eyes, and the reworking of Strangers When We Meet. It has a couple of changes. In some ways, Bowie's performance on Outside is a bit more restrained than on Buddha of Suburbia, but honestly, both versions are just great. I would probably give the Outside version a little more edge because it works very well as a conclusive song, whereas the Buddha of Suburbia version was right in the middle. And these are stunning songs, but not everything on there is really up to snuff. It is quite a long album, 75 minutes. I believe it's a little longer than the Leon Suites, or at least around the same length. But obviously, with 3 tracks over 70 minutes, we're talking like songs that last 20 minutes or more. So obviously, it is a bit of a different beast. But even then, even with this length issue, I've listened to Outside many times. After Bowie's death, I could easily clog the entire album in while working on something. If you want to delve into Bowie's experimental 1990s electronic material, because it is a very overlooked part of its discography. Everyone talks about the glam era or the Berlin era, but not that many people talk about the electronic era, and I think it is a big shame because he's put out a lot of very good albums in that era, including Buddha of Suburbia and Outside. So if you want to make an entry into his 90s era, I highly recommend Outside or the Buddha of Suburbia. Now we get into the final album of what I would actually consider. Now, this is what I personally call the Mantra Trilogy. Mantra referring to the city in Switzerland, because the Buddha of Suburbia, Outside, and this following album, Earthling, were all recorded entirely in a studio in Montreux in Switzerland. And they have this common link of experimentation with 90s electronic music. David Bowie, the Buddha of Suburbia was more of experimentation with house and material of the sort, with a bit of a jazz bent. Outside was experimentation with industrial music. Earthling is experimentation with industrial music as well as drum and bass. Now, this may be a bit... Now, not only does this album kind of have a bit of a tacky cover, but I think it is generally seen as the main album where let's put it this way, for a lot of time, Bowie could be argued to be very much a leader. If he did not invent the styles he started experimenting with, he certainly added his own flair to it and asserted himself as one of the better performers in that realm, like with glam rock. You could argue there might have been some glam outings before that. So consequently, Earthling is seen more or less at the point where Bowie has turned into an aging grandpa who's trying to look relevant and hip. And, in a sense, I can kind of see that. There are some drum and bass rhythms on there that are a little stock, such as in Little Wonder. But, once again, I am a very indulgent man. And having listened to this many times, I quite like a lot many of the songs on there. Little Wonder was one of the main singles on there. It's a very nice, sort of upbeat song with a very... where in most of the song it has this, it's backed by this neurotic drum and bass rhythm, but in some parts it suddenly breaks into a partly industrial, bombastic rock segment that really brings sort of the momentum of the song to a peak. There's also the fairly atmospheric and subdued 7 Years in Tibet. There is the explosive industrial drum and bass rocker Dead Man Walking that clocks in at 7 minutes, and I love super long and explosive tracks, and this one is no exception. Possibly the most famous song on there is I'm Afraid of Americans, which is recognized in part for the remix it would get by Trent Reznor of Nine Inch Nails. And in fact, the music video for this, I believe, is based on the Trent Reznor remix. features David Bowie Run Away from Trent Reznor. And I suppose there's also the title track, which in a way is a bit of a sort of all over the place electronic experiment that I can understand would fall flat for some, but once again, I like it quite a bit. There are just two songs that I feel are a little less rude, that have less of a major hook to them. Battle for Britain doesn't really have much to counterpoint with its electronic drum rhythm, and the last thing you should do is a bit less. And on the last thing you should do, Bowie's a little bit less involved in the vocal department. Otherwise, I honestly find it a legitimately very good album. And the associated live tour, in which he would play some electronically enhanced versions of his earlier material, is also something to look out for as well. The same goes for Outside, actually. There are a lot of very nice performances on there. And actually, the Outside tour, many of his performances would actually be done in collaboration with Nine Inch Nails. What would happen is the first half of the show would have Trent Reznor and his pals play songs from, at that point, Pretty Hate Machine, the Broken EP, and The Downward Spiral, his most famous album. He would play some songs, then for 4 or 5 tracks, Bowie would come on stage, and the two units would perform songs from each of their catalog. Oftentimes they would play, I believe, Hurt, Scary Monsters and Super Creeps. An interesting one, with Bowie and Nine Inch Nails would actually perform Reptile, a song I consider very underrated when it comes to material off The Downward Spiral, which is honestly quite a very popular album. You might know it for Hurt, which Johnny Cash made a cover of, for Closer, this very sexual industrial rocker, Heresy, March of the Pigs. You know, it's his most famous albums. It's the most famous album by Nine Inch Nails, a band with its share of great albums as well. And Earthling is not quite as notable, at least when it comes to that aspect, but it also has plenty of very good performances. And perhaps the most famous performance from that tour is the 50th birthday show that he would make at Madison Square Garden, in which he would invite a lot of famous other famous musicians, including members of Sonic Youth, I believe, Frank Black of the Pixies, and I'm not quite certain, but I think Billy Corgan of the Smashing Pumpkins was there as well. And Lou Reed. Let's not forget Lou Reed. Lou Reed was there, I believe. It was this big, momentous, well, I don't think that many people know about it now, but it was a fairly big event where he invited a lot of big names, that people that Bowie knew or was influenced by. It's a pretty good show. It's a pretty nice show. There are bootlegs of it flying around. Also, interestingly, there was a live album that is very difficult to find now, called Live and Well. It was a exclusive to members of the I believe the Bowie, an official Bowie fan club that at that point was primarily established online. It was actually it was a membership bonus for people who are part of this online like Bowie fan club, and it's very difficult to find nowadays, which is a shame because it's the only current official recording of any live performances Bowie had in the 1990s. It honestly impresses me that up until his death, we did not have that many live albums of his, and it's surprising because he has a lot of interesting live tours that could have made for, and performances that could have made for very good albums. For example, it impresses me that we had live video of the Serious Moonlight tour for Let's Dance, but we did not have an official live album until last year with the release of the Loving the Alien box set. It's a shame. And Live and Well is a very good live album as well. If you could somehow get your hands on it, legally of course, I highly recommend it. Now, we enter the late 90s, the very late 90s. Well, at this point, even I would admit that Bowie drops the ball a bit. Hours. If Earthling was Bowie trying to look relevant and hip, Hours is the point where Bowie kind of admits his old age in a sense. It is a much more reserved album when it comes to the electronic instrumentation, and when it comes to it's got much more of a rock direction, I would say, when it comes in comparison to the rest of his albums in the 1990s. And it's still pretty good, but it doesn't really have anything that is particularly classic for the artist. I like, for instance, Thursday's Child, Seven, The Dreamers, but otherwise it's a somewhat of a quaint and tired album in a way that kind of gives it charm. It is quite of a melancholic release. It's pretty good if you want something a little quieter, I suppose. Well, at least for the first half. The second half has quite a few rockers in it. Nevertheless, it's pretty good, but it's not exactly much to write home about, and I think that's the general consensus for it. I guess there are a couple interesting things about it. Well, for one, multiple of the songs on there had appeared in the David Cage game Omicron: The Nomad Soul. It was actually, you could actually purchase some of the music in game that would appear on this album, and in fact David Bowie appears as a character in it, and there's also a band called The Dreamers within the game. Second interesting tidbit, the song Something in the Air from Hours appears in the end credits of two different movies, Memento, Christopher Nolan's Memento, and the Mary Harron film American Psycho. And for that matter, The Heart's Filthy Lesson Off Outside appears at the end of Seven, the movie with the David Fincher movie. At this moment, the 1990s closed out, but something else was on the horizon, Heathen. And a few things happened that might have contributed to a bit of a comeback for Bowie. For one, he finally reconvened with Tony Visconti. Heathen would be the first album in 15 years, if not more, where Tony Visconti would be the producer, or at the very least he would collaborate with Bowie on the album. And Heathen was the result of another album attempt that ultimately got passed around as a bootleg called Toy. This yet to be released album primarily includes a couple songs that would appear on Heathen, but was predominantly an attempt to re-record a lot of his older material. And when I say early material, I don't mean Space Oddity era. I'm talking mid-60s mod era material where he was going from band to band trying to score hit singles, and none of them made hits. I'm talking material like Can't Help Thinking About Me, which he would also perform in the Hours tour. And I Dig Everything, a very good song from this early era. And Heathen, man, I don't even know how to describe Heathen. It's like, it's not quite different. It's not that different from, say, Hours. It's an alternative rock influenced album with a few electronic elements, but much more of a rock focus here as opposed to electronic. But in here everything works. It's atmospherically it's a lot stronger. The opening song Sunday is extremely ominous and extremely imposing. When you come into this after having listened to Hours, it's something else. It's morose, and the electronic elements that are there help add to the strange, in part ethereal atmosphere. And the closing title track is cut from a similar cloth, but a lot of the material is more in the vein of straightforward rockers, some of them quite heavy, and there are a few covers that at times bring the album down a little bit. For example, I've never been a major fan of I've Been Waiting for You, which is a reinterpretation of a Neil Young song. However, I do like a lot the version of Cactus by the Pixies, which I consider miles and away better than the original. I've never been a major fan of the Pixies. What else is there? There are also quite a few bittersweet songs which reflect this record status as a late career masterpiece. It's another one of his best records. And in that vein, I can easily point a single out. Everyone Says Hi. It really has that bittersweet atmosphere to it. But there are a lot of very good songs as well, such as Slow Burn or Slip Away, which have this a similar atmospheric bent as have that similar mood as Everyone Says Hi. Slow Burn, I would argue, is in the same way as Strangers When Meet and Teenage Wildlife. It's his heroes for the 2000s. All in all, another great album, which I would dare not call it essential, but once again, Bowie is that artist where after the 1980s, he more or less laid down the groundwork for all of his essential classics. And at this point, it's hard to really make a super major case for some of these albums being essential, like Outside or whatever, when they are, when they're not as recognized or as acclaimed as his earlier output. That being said, I like Heathen above Outside. I would actually probably almost put it in the top 5. I think Scary Monsters narrowly beats it, but then again, perhaps some songs could. I think the last time I've listened to it, some song grew off me just a little bit, such as A Better Future or something like that. It's only a 50-minute album, but perhaps one or two songs could have been excised. Now we get to Reality, which for a while was his final live album, and I would probably put it in the It's Alright category as well. It's the first normal David Bowie album in a sense. Every single one of them here had a sort of a gimmick to it. Here it's just David Bowie. David Bowie and that's it. And to its credit, it's a good album. Aside from the quite off-putting anime album cover, I like it quite a bit. It has a lot of very nice rockers, but aside from rockers, I don't know what else I can say about it. There are other covers. There's a cover of Pablo Picasso by the Modern Lovers that is quite great. New Killer Star, I believe the lead single for it, was also quite good. And, there are a bunch of other songs that are very good as well. Reality has quite a lot of drive, and the closing Bring Me the Disco King is this somewhat ominous piano-driven tune that lasts a whole 8 minutes and doesn't really explode into anything, but it sustained its atmosphere quite well. But there are quite a bunch of songs that aren't particularly interesting. For instance, The Loneliest Guy, it's very downbeat, it's very morose, but I don't know, there isn't that much to it. The cover of George Harrison's Try Some Buy Some isn't particularly interesting. And I don't know what else is there. Days also isn't particularly interesting. Fall Down Bob's the Moon is quite good. It's another highlight. Now, the Reality Tour would be the last time that David Bowie would perform music live. It's another very good world tour. There is a live album for it, and he covers a lot of ground on it, on this official live album. Out of all the live performances I've heard in and outside of bootlegs, the Reality Tour live album is probably the go-to for the Reality Tour. Unfortunately, the Heathen Tour is also quite interesting as well, because there is one performance at Roseland Ballroom in 2002 where he would perform both Heathen and Low in their entirety. And he would close out a bunch of shows actually with Subterraneans off Low. So if you can hunt out for soundboard recordings of live performances for Heathen, I would definitely recommend it. There are quite a lot of good performances, but I couldn't list any particular locations for that. In any case, Reality happened. Bowie went on world tour, and in 2004, he had to be taken into the hospital because of cardiac failure. He managed to survive, but he decided to lay low, and he certainly did so. His last live performances ever was with Arcade Fire in 2005, I believe. And even then it was for a couple of songs. But after that, he would lay low for basically a decade, until when he would surprise release Where Are We Now, the single Where Are We Now in 2013. And soon after came The Next Day. Once again, it's not an album I find particularly great, but it's honestly pretty good. Some might like it more than I do, because it is a bit of a good comeback. And Though a bit overlong as well. I could have removed a couple of songs here or there, but it is by all means a very fine and respectable album. It is in a similar vein as Reality as it is somewhat of a normal David Bowie album. It's primarily rock with a bit of experimentation here and there, but it's straightforward rock, nevertheless. The main distinguishing factor is that it's somewhat of an admission of Bowie's age. In the same way that Scary Monsters and Super Crease was, in parts, at least to my eyes, sort of an acknowledgement that he was no longer young and relevant as he was in the Ziggy Stardust era, this is a clear reflection of his age, that he is really, at this point, no longer a star. Where Are We Now is a bit of a reflection of that, but there is also The Stars Are Out Tonight, where, there's sort of acknowledgement that there is a whole new assortment of musical superstars out there. And the next day is also a bit of a tongue-in-cheek acknowledgement of his sudden return, because the chorus goes, "Here I am, not quite dying, my body left to rot in a hollow tree." Sort of, he's shambling out of this hollow tree suddenly, and everyone sees them. Oh, what? Otherwise, the next day, The Stars Are Out Tonight, and Where Are We Now are all great cuts. I also like the 3 songs that close out the next day, more precisely, You Will Set the World on Fire, You Feel So Lonely You Could Die, and especially the dark, ominous Heat. Otherwise, plenty of good songs, but also plenty that aren't particularly very good. I'm not a big fan of If You Can See Me or Dirty Boys. Some of these minor experiments don't work particularly well. And finally, we reach the final album in David Bowie's catalog. That being said, for multiple years between 2013 and 2016, admittedly, not much was going on Bowie's side. The main sign that at least something interesting, was about to come was the release of a single in November of 2014, at some point during 2014, titled Sue in a Season of Crime, which was completely unlike anything that Bowie had put out before. It was not industrial, it was not outright art rock, it was not dance pop. It was a strange mix of experimental jazz rock. And a very good song as well. That being said, it does come with a B-side, "'Tis a Pity She Was a Whore," which betrays which is more akin to an industrial rock song. And even then, it's definitely completely unlike the material on Earthling or Outside. Some time passed, and eventually there came a single. The 2015 single Blackstar, which turned out to be the opening song for the album of the same name. Now, at this point, it's been like 3 years since David Bowie has passed away. And it has been plenty of time for people to talk about this album, what it meant in relation to his career, the circumstances around it. And the circumstances in question make it very easy for people to go, "Yes, it's an instant classic. It's fucking amazing." Well, I'm here to tell you, I consider Blackstar to be the 4th best David Bowie album that he has ever released. I consider it up there with the other essential albums. But I am ready to say that it is not entirely just because of the circumstances around it. To put it somewhat briefly, because this recording is quite long, David Bowie was diagnosed with liver cancer. At some point, I don't know, I believe around after 2014, either around the time or a little after Sue or In a Season of Crime had been released. And consequently, much of the recording process of the album was made with that in mind. Although, very few people actually knew about David Bowie's condition. It was something that he kept very private, and even some of the people with whom he had worked during the creation of Blackstar, most of these people didn't know about it. And I believe there were a few clickbait articles trying to say, oh, maybe Bowie wasn't actually dying when he was recording the album or something like that. I do believe, indeed, at some point his cancer was in remission. But however, it worsened sometime afterwards. It's very possible because we know that Bowie had also tried to record songs for another album after this. So it's possible that around this time, the cancer was indeed in remission, and he thought he had at least more time left in him. But unfortunately, the circumstances were different. And unfortunately, we still have yet to hear these extra songs. Unfortunately, the re-released Gravy Train is a little slow on this, isn't it? God, at least with Prince, we are getting some interesting releases. There's an album coming up in maybe a week or two that are a bunch of songs that other people have performed, and it's his original performance. It's even got Nothing Compares to You, which Sinead O'Connor had sung before that. In either case, even if David Bowie wasn't dying during the recording process, or at some part of the recording process, the fact of the matter is, it doesn't necessarily cheapen the impact of the fact... It doesn't really necessarily cheapen the impact of the album. For a lot of people, for some people, there's a certain point of contention that a lot of the praise thrown onto Blackstar is that it was released very soon before he died, and that supposedly it was recorded with the fact that he knew it was going to die. And even if he turned out alright in the end, his cancer did go into remission, and even if he was still alive to this day, it is still an informed album in a sense. It is still informed by an actual experience. Even if he didn't die, it would have still been an album that... It would have still been very easy to consider this an album about someone facing the threat of death. Even if it ultimately didn't happen, it would have still been perfectly legitimate. In fact, even if he wasn't sick at all, he was perfectly healthy. If he had actually managed to put out an album like this, it would have still been very impressive. It's not an album, when you listen to it, it's an album that betrays a lot of emotional content inside it. And hell, I have had the chance, this is one of the few albums that I've pre-ordered in advance. I have actually had the chance to listen to this album before he was dead. He died, his death was announced 3 days afterwards, if I do believe, but I was able to listen to it before he died, and even then, I still thought it was extremely impressive. It was legitimately a great album, potentially even better than Heathen, which I considered, up until this point, to be his best album since, Scary Monsters and Super Creeps. At that point in time, I still didn't think that much of the Buddha of Suburbia or Outside, both of which I would actually consider better than Heathen upon further reflection. It was legitimately something very impressive. It's an album completely unlike anything he had released before. It was not just industrial, it was not just rock, it was a mix of rock and jazz, with some fairly daring song structures. The title track Blackstar is bookended by long jazzy sections that are akin to sort of a religious mass, and in the middle of it, it breaks into a much more uplifting little midsection that serves as an excellent contrast between the parts that surround it. There's also the slightly industrial and mostly jazz ditty "'Tis a Pity She Was a Whore." This is a different version from the single version, and the same applies for "Suit" or "In a Season of Crime," which also appears on here. But I find this album version to actually be even better, and once again quite an excellent song. And I also, another major highlight for a lot of people is Lazarus, because it's more or less the most explicit sort of account of his impending death. And I will admit that before I had learned of his passing, I didn't think that much of it. I thought it was rather a standard and very restrained rock tune compared to the wacky experiments surrounding it. And I will admit that after I was able to put his cancer, his disease in context with the song, it helped improve my impression of it a lot better, especially in the lyrical department. But even that, I would consider this a bit of a fair reevaluation, if I could safely say that. There are two songs that aren't quite as good as the rest. There is Sue in a Season of Crime and Girl Loves Me, which are a little cut below the rest, but are still very interesting and very nice songs to listen to. But the album definitely picks up the pace a lot in the last two songs. There's Dollar Days, a song mostly driven by Bowie in combination with an acoustic guitar, and it's a very heartbreaking song. And the mood of which is further exacerbated by the closing "I Can't Give Everything Away," which in a lot of ways recalls many different parts of Bowie's discography. I consider the percussion rhythm to be reminiscent of Black Tie White Noise dance rhythms, and there's also a harmonica part that is exactly the same as the one on A New Career in a New Town from Low. It's a slightly referential song where the main lyrical theme is the one in its title, "I Can't Give Everything Away," which is a particularly strong statement to end on because it works in a lot of ways. Two different ways you can interpret this is, number one, it's an admission that even though he would be happy to deliver more music to continue dedicating himself to his work, he is simply unable to. He can't give everything away. Or it's a reference to the fact that, for many, he is a sort of impenetrable musical chameleon that always hides behind multiple different identities without releasing music that is, at least on the whole, extremely autobiographical. We have seen glimpses of David Bowie, the individual, behind all of his different characters. We have seen, once again, I feel that Ziggy Stardust is a bit of a projection of his dream to become a superstar, and I believe that a BBC documentary discussed that. I don't know if it was 5 years or if it was The Last 5 Years, which touches upon the recording of The Next Day and Blackstar, both of which I very much recommend. They are pretty good. We have also seen, once again, his sort of moments of weakness in Station to Station and Never Let Me Down. And on Black Tie White Noise, I could feel a certain sense of jubilation following the wedding, his wedding with Iman. And perhaps it's a reference to that, the idea he can't give everything away, as in he can't reveal all of his secrets about himself. It's a record that is both, in a way, very personal, but also still very cryptic. And I really have to commend an artist that was able to finish his work with an album that was not only very, very revelatory, something that I seriously feel is that really shows him at times in a vulnerable state, because some of these songs really reflect a sort of inner struggle in reaction to something as seemingly inevitable as death. I find it extremely commendable that he was able to finish his career with an album that was not only did this, but was just as much of a Bowie album as everything else. There's once again this feeling of mystery, of a strange character, and you have to put the pieces together. For all this, for the musical experimentation therein, the successful musical experimentation therein, and for the masterfully handled lyrical themes, it easily makes it on there among his best releases. Now, we finally reach the end of this David Bowie tier list ranking. As a last little piece of information, I'll tell you which of these albums are exactly in my top 10. I should note that this piece of recording was done the next day from the previous 2 hours of audio. All right, so at number 1, you would have probably Heroes, but once again, this one is a very close second. You'd have this at number 3, number 4, and this will probably be number 5. It's the closest out of all these records that come close to really being like a 5-star 10 out of 10. As for the rest, it's a little more vague. I'd honestly think this falls just a little behind this. So that would be number 6, number 7, number 8, number 9, Lodger. And actually, my recording from yesterday where I said this barely skips the top 10, I might actually be wrong. This might just barely make it into the top 10. And bam. This was my David Bowie tier list ranking. Lasted over 2 hours. I will not waste any more of your time. This was Martin Talks for Martin Talks. See ya.